Do
Okay.
you
Can
record
can I
your
ask you?
intro separately?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so we
But I
can.
can say this is Mike and UV from the Future Thinkers something. So I don't know. The Future Thinkers podcast,
Yeah.
the Future Thinkers Collective.
It's
Future
a lot of things
thinkers.
now. You can just say from
Future
futurethinkers.org.
thinkers.
Dorg. Okay.
.org.
Dork.
Yeah, I was trying to.
Dork.
Dorg.
You guys are in Bulgaria, which is a Mediterranean area
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
probably some history to it.
It's one of the oldest, the city we live in is one of the oldest living cities in the world.
And the oldest living city in Europe.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means it's
and
been
what does that
constantly
mean?
inhabited for,
8,000 years.
yeah.
Okay. And I guess, is there a lot underneath the city then?
Yeah,
It's just
they
like
can't,
built on.
it's really not a fun thing to, buy real estate under property that hasn't been explored yet or dug. Because if you start digging to, make a basement for your new building, you end up finding Roman amphitheaters or coliseums or stuff underneath you, and that's all protected by law, so you can't
Yeah.
dig anymore.
Yeah.
Do things bottom out though? Are there like weird like crypts and stuff that just collapse and then you don't have a
I
home
haven't
anymore?
heard of that happening. It's because although those structures are pretty solid.
They're super solid.
Yeah, like marble
Romans
and-
built forever.
Yeah.
Wow. And is that how did you guys end up there? Is there family there? Is there connections, or was it just like a weird like dart on the map?
We were doing kind of a digital nomad thing for quite a while. We left Canada in 2012, and then we were living in Southeast Asia, spent a lot of time in Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Bali. Just kind of moved around a lot. And then I'd never been to Europe. UV being Russian, of course, had been coming to Europe quite a lot since she was a little kid, and had some family in Bulgaria and wanted to come check it out and show me around. So we did, and it was one of the first times we ever came to a place and decided to stay and settle down. Yeah.
And you said you were doing digital nomading, which I assume is some sort of work that's online,
Yeah.
which is translated into what you're doing now.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, before we were doing kind of more service-based stuff. We would help with media production because we both have backgrounds in, movies and
Audio.
all kinds of content production, music. So we were just basically helping brands to put together their media and make material out of it, content out of it. And we were having a lot of weird and interesting conversations in the morning because after we left for to go to Thailand, we just suddenly had a lot more time because the cost of living was low and we were making our own schedule, so we decided not to work so hard and bought a bunch of books and just were continuously reading some really interesting subjects and having conversations.
Meditating a lot as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we decided to just start recording those conversations, and that's pretty much where we arrived at today.
So it started as a literal podcast.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you guys started just recording, I guess, your intellectual development, and I guess there's probably another word other than intellectual that might be fraught, like spiritual or like mindful. I don't know the proper vanilla term, but
You're
you guys-
right. You got it right there. Yeah,
isn't
it's like a
just about
cataloging. Yeah,
the thinking.
it's a cataloging
how
of
do
our
you-
lives since 2012 or 13.
Yeah.
13, yeah.
I think we were kind of less open about our spiritual stuff for the first few years. We didn't talk about it very much in the podcast. So the podcast tends to lag in terms of what we're actually contemplating. It's not in real time for some of that stuff.
Oh, okay.
And more recently, we started being more open about our spiritual practice and all of that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How recently?
In the last year, I'd say our episodes have become a lot more about that rather than just technology and social change.
It's definitely a lot of it is rooted in psychology, and I think the bigger reason we've started to go down this route of, I wouldn't even necessarily call it spirituality, but it's just taking a kind of grand look at humanity and civilization and society and looking at past civilizations that have collapsed and trying to draw the similarities between ours and theirs. and figure out, how we can steer the ship to us all surviving, through climate change or through these different social movements that seem to be dividing people. So we've taken a real kind of narrow, solid look at psychology and sociology and tried to figure out, what makes people tick, what makes them motivated, a lot of subjects like that. And that's where the course is really kind of centered.
Mm-hmm. And
it keeps on coming back in my mind to this image of you guys sitting on top of these ruins, on top of these ruins, on top of these ruins. And you guys are like kind of, your podcast just started digging and you're just talking about the forms, but then you started talking about the murals and the content of civilization as you go on.
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, we're not really historically based. Like we just tend to kind of extrapolate from where things are now and where that goes into the future. So what happens if we all continue behaving this way?
Mm-hmm. As far as digging, I think it's a really good metaphor for digging in the mind, because we're not just reading books. We're also doing a lot of our own contemplative and meditative practices and trying to discover how the mind functions. So that I've definitely described it as digging before, both of us. Yeah.
So what do you think was the general direction of your podcast when you first began, and how did that direction change? And when did it become obvious that you guys weren't just doing intellectual work together?
I would say
wanted to do something deeper than that.
It was always kind of about doing something deeper. We had watched some, or I'll speak for myself. I was kind of more into the technology side of things, singularity kind of stuff, very heady, futuristic, utopian kind of things. And that was the initial focus, I suppose, on my side of the podcast. And then you were more on the psychology, and we kind of met in the middle somehow. But both of us really wanted to have some sort of impact, at least on people. Like, how do we change people's lives or make them think about these topics that aren't really commonly understood yet? But as far as the transition into more spiritual subject matter, I think we just got a little braver.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because we've been practicing this stuff for a long time, long before the podcast. We both started contemplating the nature of mind and reality and that kind of stuff in our teens. We were pretty private about it, I guess. And then as we learned how to talk about it better, we started talking about it on the podcast.
I think.
What do you mean talking about it better? Like
in a way that is easier to in a way that's easier to explain, because some of the stuff is kind of difficult to put into words and connect to different subjects and make sense of. And as I'll speak for myself, as I got better at explaining things, I got more comfortable with talking about it.
Mm-hmm. It seems that I think our era has been called, actually it's been a while since I heard this, but the information age, and doing sort of media production, you're just pushing information out there more and more and more. And everybody's doing that, and everybody's got a podcast now, and everybody's, well, maybe I should think of doing a podcast. Podcast is the new blog, which was the new, I guess, little zine that you did. And so I'm interested in that question that you guys asked yourselves. It seems like that, well, what is the impact that we're having on the world? And it seems like information in and of itself, or even intellectual ideas, can only ever have so much impact on somebody else's life. I mean, you're distracting them while they're going down the road, you're edifying them, you're giving them something to think about. But why did that feel unsatisfactory in and of itself? Why did you guys want to give people something more? And what is that more?
Well, I think the more is, again, kind of why we left our original jobs and industries. Like, we were doing this digital nomad thing and, making content for other brands and stuff. And the conversation in this sort of search for meaning really was the heart of everything we did. And we didn't think we would ever make an income from it, or if anyone would ever listen to it. Like, we were so happy when we found out, 10, 20 people were listening to the podcast way back in the day. But I mean, it was 2013 when we started this, so it wasn't that competitive of a time for podcast, and you could actually get some traction back then. And we were even a bit late to the party at that point, because we had heard from a lot of other friends while we were traveling around that, that's the new thing. It's going to be just so saturated in a few years, but get in right now while you've got the chance. So we kind of jumped in and never had a commercial intent for it. Never had like any intent for it other than let's have interesting conversations and see what problems we can address and discuss between us and between guests. So for that reason, I think maybe the growth has been actually stunted in a lot of ways, because we're not chasing gossip or headlines. We don't do clickbait. We don't do any of that stuff. We just try and focus on the most important or interesting conversation that can be had right now. Yeah.
And what do you mean by problems? Like, how do you said, like, what are the interesting problems that we can solve? Like, what are the kinds of problems that attract you?
Well, what you discuss on your channel quite a lot. I mean, the gender question, the identity question, a lot of the controversy surrounding Jordan Peterson and, that whole intellectual dark web movement. I mean, we pay attention to that stuff quite a lot. We don't exactly commentate on it directly, but we look at, what is the problem at the heart of people who are very identified with whatever label they happen to carry, and what would be the solution for that kind of way of being. And it tends to be more of this spiritual, psychological deconstruction of identity. That's really where it gets interesting. And we don't hear a lot of people talking about that. Like, even Jordan Peterson is not really talking about that. He just says, clean up your room, take responsibility. But we're kind of advocating people do some really deep self-analysis and contemplation and really ask themselves, what is my identity? Why do I believe this identity is true? And what is actually true about reality too? What can I actually prove exists? So that the combination of what is true and what is real and who am I at the core has a very kind of documented history in Buddhism and Hinduism and, a lot of these like self-consciousness exploration kind of traditions. And they've mapped a lot of territory. So it's funny that, there is so much mapped territory to these kind of psychedelic or transcendental experiences that people can go through, ayahuasca, acid, or deep meditation. But, there's a lot of territory that's mapped, and you haven't been the first one to traverse it.
Yeah. That's a good question, because this is a tired kind of area that I've walked with several guests and with myself quite a bit, but let's go here. So social justice ideology excites these problems of identity without necessarily giving a solution to the problem. And right now I'm going through and I'm being accused of beating a dead horse, because I'm talking about the Evergreen State College and a protest that happened 2 years ago, but I'm not beating a dead horse. I'm giving the dead horse a vivisection, and I'm going through every moment and cutting it all up. And what we see there, and actually you just brought this up, in one orientation, the professors and the faculty and the staff urged the students to see the difference between truth and reality. Like, it's true that we're all one human kind, but the reality is that some of us are different. It's true that slavery happened a long time ago, but the reality is that it still affects our lives. And they start to deconstruct this difference between truth and reality and start to meditate on these really deep questions. But it seems like they're focusing on the oppression. They're focusing on what makes those identities real and valid in that moment was the historical weight and the oppression and the heaviness and the darkness of history, which gives it a reality, but it doesn't really lead to, I guess, enlightenment or revelation or whatever.
One thing I think happens a lot is that people don't have a solid context for reality. They just look at their own personal situation and kind of measure themselves up against other people. And in Western society, we're actually quite privileged. I hate that word, actually. I shouldn't use that word. But we do have a lot of advantages over people in other places around the world. But there's that kind of teenaged angst type of emotion that happens to all of us as we start developing and experiencing the world, which is like seeking out injustices in comparison to the benefits that you have. And if you just look around at your environment and you have no context for the greater planet, you think like any little that's why the whole microaggression term comes about, because there's literally no such thing as macroaggression anymore in Western countries. Like very little anyway, I should say.
Yeah.
So people are so focused on what to them is meaningful or salient, as John Vervaeke keeps saying, which I really appreciate. What has personal meaning to them, but not bringing it into a context of where is the rest of the world at? What does a real problem look like a life-threatening kind of problem, not a social justice kind of problem. And I think that type of context would be pretty helpful for this. If people really knew what actual suffering was, not spoiled Evergreen State College suffering, but like what does it mean to lose your partner to a disease, or what does it mean to be starving, or what does it mean to, be in the middle of conflict and war, these kinds of things. And I mean, if you just leave the country or stop thinking of your world in context of your own country, you discover very quickly that you're the minority. If you're living in a Western country, you're the minority. The rest of the world is living in a third world, basically. Just open up and look at that. So why are we so concerned with these like first world problems? That's kind of my view of this, and that's how traveling has informed my view of this.
One little quick response to that you just made me think of is that, ironically enough, it's a form of privilege in Western countries to be able to get out of them, right? You're kind of in a way you're kind of stuck in the midst of all this surplus, and you're kind of below a certain kind of level. You're kind of immersed in the bounty. Which can, in and of itself, have this reaction of unable to really act, overreaction to small problems because you have no context of that. And so, Yuvi, I'm wondering, like, where does psychology come in, or like your studies in psychology come in to like situating ourselves in this, in this perspective or this proportionality of perspective?
Well, I would say that people often tend to view themselves as static, or view identity as static, or whatever their experience is as kind of solid. So I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a psychology perspective. It's maybe depth psychology or transformational psychology, you could say, or spiritual perspective, that at the end of the day, nothing about us is static, because we are humans. We are living systems. We are not even objects. Like, we like to think of ourselves as like an individual, a thing, but actually we're a collection of many, many different systems, many different cells. Every 7 years or so, all of the cells in your body are replaced. So you're not the same person at all. And we have all these different feedback loops inside of us that determine how we experience reality, and we actually have control to a degree, not fully, but to a degree we have control over those feedback loops, and we can train ourselves to experience reality differently. So, how you can bring your attention to certain things and you start feeling certain emotions, or you can pay attention to something else and you start feeling different emotions. I mean, that's at the core of all meditation practices, or self-development, where you just learn how to point your attention at different things and change your internal experience of the world. So to me, when I look at these identity discussions, it's like they're missing the whole point. They're talking about identity as if it's something solid, but it's not. You can change it. It's actually the most flexible thing about us, because it's in our mind. Like, that is the most flexible part of the human organism. You can't really change the function of your heart quite as easily. You can't change how your body looks to such a great degree as you can do with your mind. Like, yeah, of course you can go to the gym, but like the mind is the most flexible part. So when people start defending their identity, to me that's just absurd, because that's the thing that you can change the easiest.
It seems that there's a developmental way of looking at, human consciousness and or even human history. I'm very attracted to that way of thinking, and I think that identity, in and of itself, is that how we think about identity develops as we develop, and a lot of unhealthy activity or a lot of crises happen on either a personal level or a group level when somebody gets stuck in a certain level of development, and then reality kind of catches up to them. And I wonder, like, as you guys have developed as thinkers and as humans, like, how has your identity changed, and how have you guys used intellectualism and then this deeper stuff, this meditation, this practice, to kind of take the reins of your identity?
That's such a good question.
Might be too big of a question.
There's a lot of different angles to take that from, but the one that comes up most salient for me is one that has been asked a lot of people who've come to visit us, and we've been chatting about this stuff. And it's really the question of, where am I in the brain, or where am I in my identity? And I think a lot in the West, we kind of identify as this intellectual thinking being. We identify as the thinker, if you want to take the Buddhist kind of viewpoint of that. And that's something that I try to help men specifically to figure out and to shift, because we're so in the head all the time, and women will criticize us all the time for that. The idea is you want to move down, and you do this through meditation, move down almost like down to the brainstem, your attention and your awareness and your point of consciousness, and notice that thoughts come in and thoughts go out, and you're not any of those things that happen. You can generate the thinking function, but you're not the one thinking. That's a thing that you do. Thinking should be thought of as a thing that you do, not an identity. And once you really realize that through experience, and all of a sudden, all the things that happen to you, all the events in your life, the emotional response to those events become not you. There are things that are happening in the biology, there are things that are happening in the mind, and you can get separation and elevation from them, and have a little more sovereignty and decision-making ability over which ones you choose to follow and engage with.
I would add to that there's kind of this, there are two sides to this process. One is what Mike is describing, like getting distance from different processes in your brain or in your body, and realizing that they're not you, kind of having this detached observer perspective. And then there's the opposite of that process, where you completely embody something. So, and learning to oscillate between these two processes, and kind of really understanding that continuum is a lot of what happens in meditation, especially things like Vipassana. So women tend to be naturally, I would say, better kind of at embodying, just because of our biology, because women are, designed to give birth and take care of infants, and a lot of that is really nonverbal and kind of involved. Whereas men tend to be better at
tracking, strategy, lobbing objects a distance with their hands.
But in terms of the two sides of this process, getting detachment and kind of observing things impartially tends to come a little easier to men. But I think that regardless of your gender, it's practicing both of those really helps. And eventually, what happens is, like, you kind of just realize that your identity is fluid. It's constructed moment to moment. Like, it's not just a construct, like a thing, because in a lot of this kind of social justice theory, they do talk about, the social constructs, and identity is a construct a little bit, but it goes deeper than that. Like,
they take it too far into a place of ignoring kind of evolution, I think, in a big way. So they'll say gender is a construct. Like, they think everything's a construct, a social construct. It's from how you've been brought up and socialized with others. So this is another part that I think Yuvi and I like to bring into our practice, and when we're teaching other people, is like, find the root of your behavior in your evolved, in evolution. Why would you have evolved to have this behavior? What would be the context of, that guy at the bar who's like flaunting and hitting on every girl he can and, popped collar, all of that stuff? Like, what is he actually doing? If you see him in context of like a peacock or something engaged in a mating ritual, it makes a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. UV brings up the notion of embodiment, and I want to get more into that because that's something that you bring that up. I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about because like, I'm way over here, my body's over there. But it's fascinating because in the social justice lingo, they constantly talk about bodies. They take the identity, which is purely a mental thing, and then they try to root it in the bodies. I'm a black body. I'm a trans body. I'm a gay body. And it's just this weird kind of mixture of utter dehumanization of what a self is at this point. All I am is an atom in this field, and I have no responsibility for my behavior because everything that I do is just a part of history, is a part of evolution. And so I'm justified in doing whatever I want, or it's this weird inversion of this kind of complete relinquishment of the identity into this identity thing. And I'm thinking about that because that's the language that's being used during this protest to get everybody to act in this mob mentality, and going into that and watching how in sync everybody becomes in this 2-day period. Everybody's chanting the same thing, doing the same thing. And I think of it as a holographic sense making where everybody has a little bit of the picture, but nobody really has a handle on what's going on. So it's a cult without a cult leader.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's probably some sort of evolutionary basis to how this behavior happened. But I'm just wondering, could you explain a little bit more about how does one become embodied in their embodiment, or what is the practice of being situated, I guess?
Sure. So in this case, what I'm talking about when I say embodiment is being so present in your body that you don't experience yourself as a self. You experience kind of yourself as part of whatever you're doing. So let me give an example. Like, for example, if you're doing sports, like skiing down the mountain or doing something really, really intensive, you get into this flow state where you don't feel a sense of self anymore. You just kind of feel like you're one with the skis and you're one with the mountain, and you're just completely immersed in all of it. So that's what I mean when I say embodiment. So this kind of like you're fully in your body, in your senses, to the point where you're not observing your senses or thoughts or anything else as external, like it's all just one thing. And then on the opposite of that is what Mike was describing. So like getting distance and observing all of these things as an impartial.
I should explain that better. What I meant by moving the point of identity downward is really to the body. Like it's away from the mind and to the body, and realizing that you can put your attention either of those places, and we tend to choose thought or construct, identity, all of these things. We choose that instead of choosing to be in the body. And that's what Yuvi's describing is what I mean when you bring that identity position down.
Yeah. And so we're not talking about either of these modes as being optimal or better than the other.
Right.
They're just kind of different capacities that humans have, and exploring both of those capacities and expanding them to their limit and past their limit is how you really get self-knowledge.
Yeah. I'm wondering about like the ethic or the ethical dimension of this, because I grew up Christian, so there's this resistance within Christianity to Buddhism, because the way that Buddhism frames the project of humanity is like this letting go and this complete relinquishment. And for some reason, in my version of Christianity that I grew up in, like you only ever surrender to God, and God is this very defined entity. And that's the only thing that you are allowed to surrender to or to worship. You can't just open your mind, because anything can get into the mind. So that brings up the question of, when you do let go And when you do surrender into an event or into a process or into a practice, how do you understand whether you're going in the right direction? Like, what are the feedback loops, and what is the development of the moral or the ethical sense? Because it seems to me like to be a muscle, like where you can tell if I'm treating the right person the right way, or if I'm saying the right thing to the right way to a person. And if do you guys explore that, or is that interesting at all for you? Like,
So, yeah, just comment on Buddhism first. So I don't consider myself to be a Buddhist. Some of the practices that I've explored come from Buddhism or are related to Buddhism, but I don't operate from this framework of kind of a way of life or like what's the human project from the Buddhist perspective. I actually grew up Christian, or at least my mom was Christian, Russian Orthodox to be specific, so I guess it's kind of related to Catholicism. And my dad was an atheist, so I got both of those perspectives. But in terms of the experience of surrender, I would say that it's important, for me at least, to recognize kind of the holistic situation of what's happening there, because how it affects other people matters, and how it affects you in the long run also matters. So it doesn't always happen perfectly that way, but I like to think about it as kind of, as I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Schmachtenberger, but he talks about this as omni-win. So basically that your well-being is preserved to its highest degree. The well-being of those around you is preserved to the highest degree, or improved. And the well-being of the planet and everything that is alive here is preserved or improved. So it's kind of, it's finding this balance. It's not going into extremes.
I'm noticing this thread happening here in the conversation now, and I want to bring it back and loop it into what Yuvi just said. But you said something about people wanting to assemble into groups and having kind of their own holographic piece of the grander idea of what they're there for. And so there's this tendency of people to want to give up their sovereignty to something else in exchange for meaning or purpose or belonging to a group. And that's a deeply evolved trait of human beings, being very social creatures as we are. If you did something wrong in a group situation in tribal times and you got kicked out of the tribe, that almost certainly meant death. So we've evolved in such a way that, gossip and caring about what people think of us is very high on the priority list, whether we're conscious of it or not. So this idea that we would be willing to give up our personal sovereignty, our own decision-making and awareness and control of our own minds and the environment and an analysis of the environment to some sort of meaning structure like Christianity or like any of these kind of religious groups.
Or non-religious groups that operate as religious groups.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Any kind of group that gives you a sense of belonging is fitting into this evolved desire to belong. And so what we're really advocating is at least becoming aware of that and to not give up your sovereignty. You can get that feeling of belonging, but you don't have to give up your sovereignty. You can be critical of the group that you are a part of. And you can not agree with every single thing that they say, every policy, it doesn't mean that we fit into left and right wing in the political spectrum. Like, you can be somewhere in the middle. It is a gradient. Yeah. So, this is something we talk about a ton on our podcast, the concept of sovereignty, self-awareness, awareness of your perceptions, how you're taking in the world, awareness of the sense-making models internally that you are employing to those sensory experiences. Like what would be an example of a sense-making model?
So it's what things mean to you and how do you determine what they mean. So for example, if somebody screams at you, do you perceive it as an attack? Do you perceive it as them trying to get your attention? Or maybe it has nothing to do with you at all. Maybe they just had a bad day. So that's sense making. Like, how do you make sense of what's happening? And are you aware of the processes of that your mind is going through to make sense, or are you just kind of looking through that and are unconscious of it? So sovereignty in the definition that we talk about it is basically just self-awareness of these different kinds of processes and learning to not necessarily control them, because it's not about like having full control over what's going on, but just to understand what's going on and be able to direct your own mental processes.
So now to loop it back to the morality and Christianity question, it's the way I view it, and I could be wrong about this, but the way I view religion is a response to people's natural desire to want to give up their sovereignty and belong to a group, and for these organizations to want to somehow make society function properly. So they write things down and they say, okay, 10 commandments, this is how we believe a functioning society should work. Or, you know, every religion's got their own equivalent of some rule set that you should follow. And when it comes to Buddhism or some of these more contemplative practices, there aren't really a lot of rules, or at least, you know what, I should discard the Buddhist thing and really just talk about what it's like to be sovereign. So if you operate from your own sovereignty and you recognize that other people have an experience as rich and whole as your own, then that whole do unto others as you would have done unto you rule becomes the automatic best thing you could possibly do. It's something, instead of giving up your sovereignty to some religion, you can just say, would I like that? Probably not. Then I shouldn't do that to others. And it just becomes such an easy thing to be part of a functioning society.
There was that, I was just thinking about this last night. I was taking a break from video making, and I was playing Spider-Man video game, you know, like swinging around the city. And I was thinking about
PS4
Kant.
one?
Yeah, the new one. It's actually pretty relaxing.
Yeah.
It's very meditative. And I was thinking about Kant. I can't remember what it's called. He's got this moral kind of framework, or this calculation, where if it's bad for other people, then it's bad for me to do. I can't remember how he formulates it, which I really should, because it's like a foundational concept in Western thought. But I was just thinking about like this exponential kind of thought experiment. Like if everybody around me started to value this behavior, it would translate. How would that translate into the erosion or the construction of the next event or the next emergence?
Well, think about it in terms of law. Like, how often do people, instead of using their own moral compass, go instead to what can I legally get away with? And they find loopholes in legal systems to do horrible shit to other people.
Yeah.
So I think net it would probably be a really great thing for society if we all just use that framework.
But this is the problem that comes up again and again and again with good thinking or good thoughts or self-development. When you start thinking on a systems level, the question automatically becomes, how are people going to game this? And that's the one of my main arguments against social justice. That I think it's not an attack on social justice, but the argument against it is that how can this be exploited? Because it seems like it's very easy to exploit, and that in and of itself is a good enough reason to be wary of it and to deconstruct it and to think of something better.
Yeah, I feel the exact same way.
So within like contemplative, I guess you guys root it constantly in personal responsibility. This guiding light, or this lighthouse of sovereignty, keeps you guys on course, or keeps you guys coming back from going too far out in any direction. And I'm wondering if you guys have thought about developing tools to help society, and if you're seeing like the tool, how is it going to be corrupted, or how does the knife become a weapon or a hammer become a weapon? You know, that every tool is a weapon thing. Have you guys thought about that? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
Group practices, and how do you stop being a cult or going down that path?
Yeah, definitely have thought about that a lot, and which is kind of why we have ended up with the sovereignty framework, because it seems to safeguard against a lot of those things. So if people practice having sovereignty, practice having self-awareness, and recognizing that there's something to their internal authority that can override the authority of others. So like, if some political leader says go jump off a bridge, you should have enough sense not to do that because it would be harmful for you. And I mean, this is a stupid example, but you know what I mean. It happens every day when, somebody of authority says, oh, we should all do this, and then people just follow blindly. So sovereignty guards against that. But it also guards against arrogance in many ways, because it's about taking responsibility and about constantly recognizing that, yeah, you make mistakes and you're not perfect, because it's like it's encouraging self-awareness, right? So the second part that we haven't brought up yet is shadow work. So that's investigating your unconscious mind and kind of all of the animal tendencies that we still have, and all of our darkest thoughts and all of our deepest fears and all of those things, and recognizing that it's not really possible to get rid of all of that. The best thing you can do is become aware of it and somehow learn to channel it in a more, socially appropriate and productive way, while at the same time learning to accept yourself, that it's all right that you have these tendencies. Like, it doesn't make you a bad person. As long as you don't act on them, you're probably going to be okay. So that's something actually that I applaud Jordan Peterson for bringing into the mainstream, is the talk of the shadow and the unconscious. He's kind of, has created a revival of Jungian, or an interest in Jungian thought, which I think is really great, because there's so much of the mind that is unconscious, and a lot of the kind of recent thinking has been more focused on conscious thought. So having that piece is
I think
important.
one of the consistent mistakes that humans make is that we have this capacity to separate ourselves from the environment, a capacity to manipulate the environment. And what we end up doing in order to do that, we separate ourselves from everything else. So, and this happens in every aspect of human behavior or life, but within spiritual practice or contemplative practice, the individual separates themselves from everything, and separates themselves from the darkness, separates themselves from sin, separates themselves from, as you put it, the unconscious forces. And that separation it's not even a wall. It's just this screen that one is pretending that is there. And going back and being able to separate yourself from your instincts, it's good. It's necessary to stand apart from nature in order to, arrange it, to organize it. But it's really difficult. And Jung talk about this, and I guess Peterson talks about this, but you guys are interested in exploring this. It's unhealthy to do that too much, because you're going to get again exploited by all these unconscious forces if you don't recognize them. So how do you guys initiate that process of reckoning and recognizing that shadow, or that which is underneath the floorboards?
Well, it's why UV brings up the embodiment thing. It's such an important part, because you want, like you said, you want the distance, but that's only half of the whole thing. Like you want to actually really be those things as well. You want to experience them at a depth, so you understand your own limits. So, and like you said, there's ways to channel all of those energies into something more productive. And, Yuvi brought up Jung. He has kind of this framework of the archetypes that you can embody and use and study and understand the way that, a deficit in a certain archetype, like the warrior, the passive version of the warrior's shadow, might result in you being a weakling and not being able to have the confidence and drive to go out there and exercise your will. And that's a necessary thing if you want to be productive and functional and successful in Western society. You do need to exercise your will, make decisions, be decisive. But then on the other end of the spectrum, too much of that will make you a tyrant and make you sadistic and harmful to other people. So there is sort of this balance for each of the four archetypes, masculine archetypes, I should say, that just by studying it and becoming aware, you can find where you are on the whole spectrum and balance yourself to the center. So another one would be the magician. I don't know. Do you want me to go through these? We can do that.
Sure. Yeah, this is fun. Is this fun for you, Yuvi?
So, yeah.
Tell me the magician's power.
You do this one.
Sure. Well, I would say actually these Gillette and Moore are the writers of this book that Mike is referencing. So it's called Warrior, Magician, Lover, King.
King, Warrior, Magician, Lover.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So these are commonly considered the four most prominent masculine archetypes, but they also apply to women. And then feminine archetypes would be basically the feminine versions of those four plus the mother archetype. And that's more kind of biologically based. So the magician archetype could be, talked about in the masculine sense or in the feminine sense. But the kind of the passive version of this is not recognizing your own power and creativity and capacity to investigate reality and manipulate reality. And the active version of this, the overactive, is being too manipulative and being kind of a know-it-all and
gaining deep knowledge but not sharing it with anyone.
Yeah. And so again, we come back to like being on the extreme is not good. Like getting to know where those extremes are inside of you through some sort of meditation or contemplation practice is really good. But then when it comes to your action in the world, becoming some sort of a balanced version of those things is probably most optimal. Or if, obviously people have different personalities and different capabilities, so maybe leaning slightly to one side or the other is all right, but not going too much to the extreme.
We actually have a 4-part, or no, it's more, it's like 8 parts series on the archetypes that we cover on our podcast. So maybe we should reserve that for that kind of extended content piece. But
sure. I just wanted to bring it back to embodiment. So it's having this very full body experiential knowing of what it's like. So for example, when we're talking about exploring the shadow, it's not just recognizing kind of as an observer, oh yeah, I have this anger at my dad because he didn't give me enough attention when I was little, or like he punished me or whatever. These kinds of common things that people start discovering when they start investigating their own mind. Well, okay, so what does that feel like to be in that experience, to be that 4-year-old child and experience that, and bringing yourself back to that experience, and then recognizing, oh, actually, when I'm in this exact embodied experience, I feel like I have no power because I'm 4, right? Like I don't understand the world, I have no power in the situation. And then recognizing that the patterns that were created as a result of whatever experience are no longer applicable. And people often have patterns, that are based in childhood experiences, but by embodying that experience and recognizing, oh, actually now I do have the power to change my situation and I can respond differently. So that's how embodiment can be used to kind of work through some of those shadow patterns and become better.
It's interesting. I heard a little voice, not in my head, but I was just perceiving a voice out there, this attitude out there about this kind of work. Where it's like, well, why would you want to do that? It's a waste of time. It's foofy. It's narcissistic. You're exploring all these things that doesn't really mean anything. Doesn't really matter. It doesn't really do anything in the world. And I'm not saying that at all. I'm just I want to bring that kind of attitude into the conversation and ask your guys' position on that voice. But I was just thinking, the world starts to act really crazy and we want to know why, or my life starts to go down the shitter and I want to know why. And it seems like your guys' proposition is to start asking the question, or to start asking a series of questions of where's my attention, and when you start asking where's my attention, then you can start to map out, well, what are all these other things that are going on that I usually because they operate, and when they operate everything's fine, but when they get out of hand, I need to start to initiate like this process of self-discovery and of societal discovery of like what's really going on here, guys, because this is going out of control.
It's the same reason you would train in, why, let's take Sparta, for example, the movie 300. They would train these warriors all their lives from a young age to be able to be the most effective when the time, hopefully it never came, but if it ever came, they would be the most effective. So you can say it in the same way about investigating your fears. Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, actually. He said one of the best things you can aspire to do is to be everyone's rock, be the most stable person at your father's funeral. And I love that way of saying that. I think that's incredibly valuable. And I've been to quite a number of funerals already. And I think that is an incredibly valuable thing. Like that sticks with people forever. Like that emotional support and recognition of someone who's seen it before and struggled. So I think that's one of the reasons you would do this investigative work, ask these questions. It's not all just like, how do I optimize myself to be more productive during the day? It's like, really deep, meaningful family life kind of questions that you can truly find answers to. And the other part would be, how are you on a day-to-day basis? Are you feeling generally anxious? Do you have kind of fears in the back of your mind about, your prospects for the future? Are you feeling jealous? Like any of these kind of typical emotions you feel on a daily basis, these are all really dealt with in this process we're describing. You can be anxiety-free. You can sleep well. You can be productive and be clear-minded, know your purpose and direction in life. You can do all those things. And if you do any kind of study of successful people, you can really see that that's something they've worked on.
There's another part to it as well, because as you mentioned, Ben, there's a lot of chaos in the world right now, and things are kind of going sideways in many different ways. And whereas in the past, this might have been more of an optional process, and people could just function with all of those things being unconscious, now there are so many forces that are pushing and pulling us in different directions, sometimes on purpose. Like, some of the most brilliant engineers go to work for companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon that, design algorithms to manipulate your behavior and manipulate your attention. So some of those things are designed that way, to pull our attention in different ways or manipulate us. And some of those things just kind of happen, like different changes in society that affect you,
Environmental catastrophes, mass shootings, all of these things.
Yeah, so we're being pushed and pulled in all these different directions. And developing our sovereignty, developing our self-awareness, understanding our own unconscious tendencies, it becomes a really important tool to navigate these stormy waters. It's like... Yeah, it's like you're either in a little, boat,
a dinghy.
in a dinghy in a storm, or you're in a really solid ship. And so building up that ship is what this is exactly. It's like being able to withstand the storm and not crumble.
That's why I chose the Spartan metaphor. You're training for something that you hope never happens. Mm-hmm. But you can just look around and know that these things are happening.
Yeah.
So
I was just thinking, and I didn't want to broach this topic on my own, but about the shootings that happened last weekend or a few days ago in America. And I don't like talking about death. I think that I got criticized once because somebody on one of my episodes said that their mom had just died, and I did not, give my condolences on camera. I kept that off the camera because that's not something that I want to make a performance of. I do not want to make a performance out of my reaction to death. I think that that's a sacred thing. But I can talk about the performance of how people react to death. And with the shootings, what I saw, of course, was people were scrambling for the blame. Like, oh, this shooter was a right-wing nut job. It's Trump's fault. Or this shooter was, he praised Antifa. It's Antifa's fault. And people were scrambling to blame the shooter's action on this ideology when it's that very ideology that caused them to act that way. It was that very act of blaming. I'm going to go out and I'm going to blame this other group. And then these people capitalize on this righteousness to say, oh, well, now we can win more people over to our cause, which is the same exact thing that's causing that war. And I just wish, and you can't do it, but I just wish people would just stop and preserve that performance, watch what's causing them to want to perform in this way, to react in this way, and to hold the space for the families, for the reality, and not cause that reality, that tragedy, to feed into more tragedy, to feed into more reaction. And you can't do it because it's social media and people have to say things. But I just wish that people would cultivate that and just to cultivate the understanding of how they are making more waves by reacting to a wave. Like, it just seems so simple, but
yeah, you said it perfectly.
Yeah.
I have no comment. That's it.
Agreed.
Unfortunately, I have to go, and speaking about drama, there's a professor who's getting investigated by his university for some stupid thing, but I have to go and help him figure out what's going on, or at least let him tell his story, which should be interesting. But what's next up for you guys, or what are you guys doing in the world right now, and where's your project going?
We have 3 main things on the go right now, and I don't really know how we're getting it all off the ground, but we have 2 courses that we, basically covers in depth a lot of what we've discussed in this conversation. First one's about sovereignty, the second one's about shadow work. So we just finished those a few months ago. We've had, I think, probably maybe 50, 60 people come through, and people are getting really interesting results from it, really positive results. So that's the first thing, and we're just trying to get the word out about that. The second thing is we're building a new meditation app that kind of just gives practical, and how do I say it? It's kind of a process that we've stumbled upon through a lot of meditation, and it just covers a lot of ranges of the different types of meditations and tries to give you a functional, holistic meditation practice. So we're designing this app right now that covers, a range of these meditation practices that we discuss on the podcast. And
by app, you mean a web app, or like
a meditation app? So like on your phone.
On your phone, yeah.
Yeah, it will be web as well. So there's that. And then the third thing is we're going to be building a retreat center in Bulgaria, which is where we live. There's just a lot of things about Bulgaria. We've already discussed some of them.
Wow.
That I think make this place a really special place to do something like that. So it's really going to be combining all 3 of those things, what we cover in the course, what we do with the meditation stuff, and then, bringing people together and having a community. And we want to attract change makers and people in positions of being able to do something in the world and kind of bring them to this place and discuss these topics and help them have embodied experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you guys are at freethinkers.org.
Futurethinkers.org.
Free, not free, future. And all your stuff is on that website, and people can find all your stuff. You guys also run a podcast and a YouTube channel.
Yep.
And is there a schedule for that? How often do you guys put out content on that?
It should be once a week. It's not. I think we haven't done one for a few weeks now, but generally we like to say once a week, but we're lying.
But when people sign up for your courses, they actually enter into, you guys, we didn't talk about this on the show, but you guys have like these web conferences, and you
we do this group call with people who have gone through the course, and it's usually only people who have gone through the course, and it's really about collective intelligence. It's become really interesting because when people go through the course, there's this kind of ego dissolution thing that seems to be happening, and so we don't have any agenda or subject matter discussed before the conversation actually happens. It just kind of is free flowing and it goes where it goes. Yesterday's lasted 3 hours.
Oh wow, okay.
And it's just, everyone says they get so many synchronicities from it, and so many things they were thinking about get discussed during that week's calls. So yeah, those are pretty interesting. They're probably the most interesting thing, but
it's just ground you guys cover. It seems like you guys are like an exploratory. You guys just go on these long exploration conversations.
Yeah, I would say that's correct.
Yeah, we're trying to, I guess, do both like in depth and explore the breadth to kind of connect all the different parts, because sometimes it's tempting to just compartmentalize things like, oh, this is about physics or this is about psychology, but all of those things are connected. So we do try to kind of go broad, but at the same time go deep in the areas that are particularly relevant to what we're doing. So like psychology and meditation, we go pretty deep, and then some other things we kind of touch on without going too deep.
Anthropology.
Yeah.
Sociology.
Yeah.
All the ologies.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for your time, guys. I will direct everybody to your shop. Hopefully we can have another conversation, and
We'd love it.
It seems like tons of places for us to go together, but hopefully people will stumble upon and just adventure with you guys. Building a retreat center, that sounds like a monumental undertaking.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Just add it to the list. Yeah. But I mean, it's one of the advantages of us being married and working together is our entire lives become about what we talk about. And we're both so passionate about this stuff that, it's work all consumed.
Wonderful. Can you guys say goodbye?
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks. No, I gotta say though, before we go, like I really appreciate what you're doing as well, and just the depth of understanding that you have in these subjects that you're talking about. And I think there's a need for what you're doing. So thanks for having us on and for doing what you do.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, you brought up earlier that you guys don't do clickbait, and I'm like, well, I kind of do a little bit of clickbait. So, but hopefully, like, there's a network of
you can be our
what's beyond the
clickbait buffer.
Maybe
I'm going to end the recording there.
give us some pointers on how to do ethical and meaningful clickbait.
Yeah.
There's got to be mindful clickbait. Yoga pants, like it's right there. Like that's all you guys need.
Yeah,
like
that's
it's
true.
a holistic.
Just a shot of a butt in
mind,
yoga
body,
pants in the thumbnail.
Oh God.
transcendent.
Yeah, let's just do that, and then the title over top of it, done. Yoga pants, and deconstructing the identity.
Peeling off the identity.
Yeah.
There's a bent over butt and downward dog.
Yeah, exactly.